being toward the end was determined in a preliminary existential sketch as being toward one's ownmost, non-relational, and insuperable potentiality of being. Existing being sane toward this possibility brings itself before the absolute impossibility of existence. Beyond this seemingly empty characteristic of being toward death, the concretion of this being revealed itself in the mode of everydayness. In accordance with the tendency toward falling prey essential to everydayness, being toward death proved to be an evasion of it, an evasion that covers over. Whereas previously our inquiry made the transition from the formal preliminary sketch of the ontological structure of death to the concrete analysis of everyday being toward the end, we now wish to reverse the direction and attain the complete existential concept of death by filling out the interpretation of everyday being toward the end. The explication of everyday being toward death stayed with the idle talk of the they. One also dies sometime, but for the time being not yet. Up to now, we solely interpreted the one dies as such. In the also sometime, but for the time being not yet, everydayness acknowledges something like a certainty of death. Nobody doubts that one dies. But this not doubting need not already imply that kind of being certain that corresponds to the way death, in the sense of the eminent possibility characterized above, enters into Dasein. Everydayness stops with this ambiguous acknowledgement of the certainty of death in order to weaken the certainty by covering dying over still more and alleviating its own thrownness into death. By its very meaning, this evasive covering over of death is not capable of being authentically certain of death, and yet it is. How does it stand with this certainty of death? To be certain of a being means to hold it for true for warhalten as something true, but truth means discoveredness of being. All discoveredness, however, is ontologically based in the most primordial truth, in the disclosedness of Dasein 14 as a being that is disclosed in disclosing, and one that discovers. Dasein is essentially in the truth. But certainty is based in truth, or belongs to it equiprimordially. The expression certainty, like the expression truth, has a double meaning. Primordially, truth means the same as being disclosive as a mode of behavior of Dasein. From this comes the derivative meaning, disclosedness of being. Accordingly, certainty is primordially tantamount to being certain, as a kind of being of Dasein. However, in a derivative significance, any being of which Dasein can be certain is also called cert. One mode of certainty is conviction. In conviction, Dasein lets the testimony of the thing itself that has been discovered, the true thing itself, be the sole determinant for its being toward that thing understanding. Holding something for true, verwahrhalten, is adequate as a way of keeping oneself in the truth, if it is based on the discovered beings themselves, and as being sane toward the beings thus discovered, has become transparent to itself with regard to its appropriateness to them. Something like this is lacking in any arbitrary fiction or in the mere opinion about a being. The adequacy of holding for true is measured by the truth claim to which it belongs. This claim gets its justification from the kind of being of the beings to be disclosed, and from the direction of the disclosure. The kind of truth and, along with it, the certainty, changes with the various kinds of beings, and accords with the leading tendency and scope of the disclosure. Our present considerations are limited to an analysis of being certain with regard to death, and this being certain will, in the end, present us with an eminent certainty of Dasein. For the most part, everyday Dasein covers over its ownmost, non-relational and insuperable possibility of being. This factical tendency to cover over confirms our thesis that Dasein, as factical, is in untruth. Thus the certainty which belongs to such a covering over of being toward death must be an inappropriate way of holding for true, and not an uncertainty in the sense of doubting. An appropriate certainty keeps that of which it is certain covered over. If one understands death as an event encountered in the surrounding world, the certainty related to this does not get at being toward the end. They say that it is certain that death comes. They say it and overlook the fact that, in order to be able to be certain of death, Dasein itself must always be certain of its ownmost, non-relational and insuperable potentiality of being. They say that death is certain, and thus implant in Dasein the illusion that it is itself certain of its own death. And what is the ground of everyday being certain? Evidently, it is not just mutual persuasion. Yet one experiences daily the dying of others. Death is an undeniable fact of experience. The way in which everyday being toward death understands the certainty thus grounded betrays itself when it tries to think about death, even when it does so with critical foresight, that is to say, in an appropriate way. So far as one knows, all human beings die. Death is probable to the highest degree for every human being, yet it is not unconditionally certain. Strictly speaking, only an empirical certainty may be attributed to death. Such certainty falls short of the highest certainty, the apodictical one, which we attain in certain areas of theoretical knowledge. In this critical determination of the certainty of death and its imminence, what is manifested in the first instance is, once again, the failure to recognize the kind of being of Dasein and the being toward death belonging to it, a failure characteristic of everydayness. The fact that demise, as an event that occurs, is only empirically certain, in no way decides about the certainty of death. Cases of death may be the factical occasion for the fact that Dasein initially notices death at all. But remaining within the empirical certainty which we characterized, Dasein cannot become certain at all of death as it is. Although in the publicness of the Dasein seemingly talks only of this empirical certainty of death, basically it does not keep exclusively and primarily to those cases of death that merely occur. Evading its death, everyday being toward the end is indeed certain of death in another way than it would itself like to realize in purely theoretical consideration. Everydayness mostly hides this in another way from itself. It does not dare become transparent to itself in this way. We have already characterized the everyday attunement that consists in an air of superiority with regard to the certain fact of death, a superiority that is anxiously concerned, while seemingly free of anxiety. In this attunement, everydayness acknowledges a higher certainty than the merely empirical one. One knows about the certainty of death, and yet is not really certain about it. The entangled everydayness of Dasein knows about the certainty of death, and yet avoids being certain. But in the light of what it evades, this evasion itself bears witness phenomenally to the fact that death must be grasped as the almost non-relational, insuperable, certain possibility. One says that death certainly comes, but not right away. With this but, though they denies that death is certain. Not right away is not a merely negative statement, but a self-interpretation of the they with which it refers itself to what is initially accessible to Dasein to take care of. Everydayness penetrates to the urgency of taking care of things, and divests itself of the fetters of a weary, inactive thinking about death. Death is postponed to some time later by relying on the so-called general opinion. Thus the they covers over what is peculiar to the certainty of death, that is possible in every moment. Together with the certainty of death goes the indefiniteness of its when. Everyday being toward death evades this indefiniteness by making it something definite. But this procedure cannot mean calculating when the demise is due to arrive. Dasein rather flees from such definite. Everyday taking care of things makes definite for itself the indefiniteness of certain death by interposing before it those manageable urgencies and possibilities of the everyday matters nearest to us. But covering over this indefiniteness also covers over certain. Thus the almost character of the possibility of death gets covered over, a possibility that is certain and yet indefinite, that is, possible at any moment. Now that we have completed our interpretation of the everyday talk of the they about death and the way death enters Dasein, we have been led to the characteristics of certainty and indefiniteness. The full existential and ontological concept of death can now be defined as follows. As the end of Dasein, death is the almost non-relational certain, and as such, indefinite and insuperable possibility of Dasein. As the end of Dasein, death is in the being sane of this being sane and toward its end. The delineation of the existential structure of being toward themed helps unfold a kind of being of Dasein in which it can, as Dasein, be whole. The fact that even everyday Dasein is always already toward its end, that is constantly coming to grips with its own death, even though fleetingly, shows that this end, which concludes and defines being whole, is not something which Dasein ultimately arrives at only in its demise. In Dasein, existing cien toward its death, its most extreme not yet which everything else precedes, is always already included. So if one is given an ontologically inappropriate interpretation of the not yet of Dasein as something outstanding, any formal inference of the not yet of Dasein as something outstanding, any formal inference from this to the lack of wholeness of Dasein, will be incorrect. The phenomenon of the not yet has been taken from the ahead of itself. No more than the structure of care in general can it serve as a higher court that would rule against a possible, existent existence wholeness. Indeed, this ahead of itself first makes possible such a being toward the end. Problem of the possible being whole Gansins of the being Sayenden, which we ourselves in each instance are, is legitimate if care, as the fundamental constitution of Dasein, is connected with death as the most extreme possibility of this being. Yet it remains questionable whether this problem has been adequately worked out. Being toward death is grounded in care. As thrown being in the world, Dasein is always already delivered over to its death. Being toward its death, it dies factically and constantly as long as it has not reached its demise. That Dasein dies factically means at the same time that it has always already decided in this, or that way in its being toward death. Everyday, entangled evasion of death is an inauthentic being toward it. Inauthenticity has possible authenticity as its basis. Inauthenticity characterizes the kind of being in which Dasein diverts itself, and for the most part has always diverted itself, but it does not have to do this necessarily and constantly. Because Dasein exists, it determines itself as the kind of being it is, and it does so always in terms of a possibility which it itself is and understands. Can Dasein authentically understand its own most non-relational, insuperable certain possibility that is, as such, indefinite? That is, can it maintain itself in an authentic being toward its end? As long as this authentic being toward death has not been set forth and ontologically determined, there is something essentially lacking in our existential interpretation of being toward the end. Authentic being toward death signifies an existential possibility of Dasein. This ontic potentiality of being must in its turn be ontologically possible. What are the existential conditions of this possibility? How are they themselves to become accessible?